Hello and welcome to Global Eye. India's GDP growth slowed down to 4.5% in the second quarter. This is the fifth consecutive quarter of deceleration and the slowest pace of growth in more than 6 years. Manufacturing was the main culprit, with growth contracting by 1% compared to last year. Growth in mining and agriculture also saw a substantial decline. Joining us now to discuss these developments is Arvind Panagariya, former Vice Chairman of the NITI Aayog. Mr. Panagariya, the kind of slowdown that we are looking at, the GDP numbers coming down to 4.5%, would you say that we're now staring at a deeper cyclical slowdown, or is the worst over?
I'm sort of tempted to think that the worst is over. In the next quarter, we should see some turnaround. Those are also the indications from, the Diwali sales and so forth. The indications from post-September seem more positive. So I'm inclined to be optimistic.
All right, you're inclined to be optimistic, but do you also feel that the current economic situation would force foreign investors, foreign companies to revisit their India plans?
No, I don't think so. You see, for the foreign investors, it's a more longer-term investment. And from a longer-term perspective, I see no trouble in the Indian economy. The government has reacted well, introducing some reforms. No real mistakes that I see. So, it is a matter of a bit of a patience. We have seen this movie run before, people don't look at the data. But if you look back, in the 1990s, we had gone to about 6.5%. Then for 3 years, in the first 3 years of this century, there was a slowdown to about 4.3%. Then we grew for 9 years at 8% plus. Then again, we fell below 6%. Then 5 years of Modi period, 7.5%. Now we see a slowdown again. So I don't think we fully understand why this is happening, why this sort of cycle is repeating itself. But, we have always come out of it. And I've given you numerous of these that we have seen since 1991 reforms. So I would be patient and a little optimistic. So from foreign countries' viewpoint, I don't think they need to revisit.
All right, they don't need to revisit, but the government has been taking several steps to do a course correction as far as the economy is concerned: reduction in corporate tax, setting up a special real estate fund, bank merger, going on a privatization drive as well. The RBI has cut interest rates by almost 135 basis points so far. But why do you think these measures have so far not improved the sentiment? Going forward, what does the government really need to do?
See, there's always a lag between the policy measures and the response. My favorite example is the numerous reforms that the Vajpayee government had done. And during, there several, of the last 4 years, the first 3 of those were characterized by a growth rate of something like 4%. It was only in their last year, 2003-04, that the economy finally jumped to an 8% trajectory. So there is always this lag. What I am really pleased about is that the government is actually moving ahead with structural reforms on multiple fronts, including also, by the way, the fixed-term contracts that are seen to be going to be introduced through the labor code on industrial relations. So I would just simply, right now, maybe the RBI could cut the interest rate a bit further, maybe 50 basis points or more. That is something that can be done. But other than that, if I look in the data, the current GDP data that has just been released, the government expenditures are reasonably robust. The consumption also actually has come up some. It's the investment which then has taken the hit. But there should see some correction going forward. So I would simply be a little more patient.
All right, you would be more patient about this. Mr. Panagariya, thank you very much for joining us on Global Eye on CNBC TV18. Let's now take this forward. We're joined by Jayant Krishna, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Also, somebody who is a member of the Vadvani Foundation, Rajiv Biswas, Executive Director at IHS Markit. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here. Mr. Jayant Krishna, coming to you, how do you see these GDP numbers? Do you think foreign investors, foreign companies would be worried? Would they like to tweak their plans now?
I think GDP numbers are a bit worrisome, but I don't think it's a cause for any FDI investors to revisit the plans. For one simple reason, India is just too big a market to be ignored by anybody. But the way I see it, it's a huge opportunity to have big ticket reforms in the country. And some reforms like reduction of corporate tax has been done from an effective rate of 35% to an effective rate of 25%, which is a big step. But I think some reforms which are crying for interventions are land reforms, land acquisition reforms. Land acquisition cost in India has become exorbitant. The process is so cumbersome after the 2013 Act. I think it has become a politically non-touchable kind of a reform, but I think it's very, very important to look at this very wholesome in a wholesome manner, because if you look at the rural areas, the payout is almost 3 times the market rate, and in urban areas it's about 2 times. Labor reforms that Dr. Panagariya also spoke about. I think we have 44 federal reforms, and some states have as many as 100 to 200 state level labor laws. Now these have to be reformed. I mean, these have become an entry barrier for investments to come, not only in the form of FDI, but also domestic expansion plans and domestic investments. So I think, these are opportunities. And one thing which I must say that I think if you look at Human Development Index, which is about 130th, I think, both the healthcare and education skills, these areas are hugely, crying for reforms. New, education policy has been announced, but the fact is, how well it is implemented.
Right.
It's still, there are a lot of gaps there. For example, employability of students is poor. How do you mainstream employability education from class 9 onwards till the undergrad level, till the completion of undergrad education? How do you bring apprenticeship where you soil your hands and learn the hard way, and as a part of the undergrad curriculum? How entrepreneurship education is mainstreamed? I think these things are very, very important. If you look at Industry 4.0 technologies, it's a big menace everywhere, and especially in a labor-intensive country, high population country like India. But nobody is seriously looking at, including that in education as well as skills curriculum. I think these things are very important. Some reforms, you spoke about the PSU bank merger. Yes, that's a good step. But merger alone won't take you far. It is important to professionalize the boards. It's important to, I would even go to an extent of that, the majority stake in PSU banks should be given to private sector players from within or outside the country. The change of management, the kind of huge reform that we expect would see the light of the day. So I think these things, to my mind, are very, very important and cannot be neglected. Reforms have to happen at the speed of thought, very clearly. Big ticket reforms have to happen, because this is the first year of the second term of the government.
Let me get in Rajiv Biswas as well. Right. I'll come back to you. Mr. Rajiv Biswas, you've been waiting patiently. How long do you think will it take India to come back on the growth path from a 4.5% GDP?
In the Indian economy right now, manufacturing seems to be heading into recessionary conditions. Capital goods output in September was down 21% year on year. Construction-related output also down about 6% year on year. And the auto sector output is down about 25% year on year. These are appalling numbers, and clearly, I think there's a sense of, I get a sense of complacency that India seems to be okay from some of the other comments that I heard. It's not okay. There's a lot of problems in the public sector banks, still a lot of bad debts on their balance sheets. There's problems in the non-bank financial companies. That's a very important reason why the auto sector is showing very weak performance, because non-banks are not able to provide the finance for auto loans. So I think basically there's a fundamental slowdown going on in the Indian economy. The Indian government has taken some action on the corporate tax rate, but it's not going to have any immediate impact. So I think there is a need for
Mr.
accelerated government measures to stimulate growth. And also I think that there needs to be some action to support the balance sheets of non-bank financial companies as well. Right. Otherwise, I think there is a risk.
Mr. Biswas, in the Parliament sometime back, the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said that yes, there is a slowdown, but there will never be a recession. So how would you respond to that? Are things under control right now?
I think long ago, the Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan in those days said that the business cycle has not been repealed, and I think that's also the case for India. The business cycle has not been repealed. There is in the history of every economy, there have been recessions, and India will have at some point a recession. Whether it's now, it's not clear yet whether that will happen. I think a lot will depend on government action. But if the government doesn't take imminent action to try to stabilize the situation, there is a risk certainly of further slowdown, particularly in manufacturing. What's really worrying is that the investment cycle is so depressed. I mean, despite 5 years of efforts by the government to try to improve infrastructure spending, we're still seeing capital goods output down 21% year on year. So I don't think that it's really coming through. And the reasons for that, are quite complex, but nevertheless, bottom line, manufacturing's pretty much in recession at the moment.
That's right. Let me also get in Mr. Jayant at this point. Mr. Jayant, you've been hearing Rajiv there. What do you think the government now needs to focus on? A number of steps have been taken. I'd also like to ask you about the recent report that came out in the Business Standard. This was on the consumption spending, and it said that rural consumption came down to 8.8%. The overall consumption spending came down to about 3.7%. This was on the basis of an NSSO report. The government is not releasing this report because they feel that there are certain deficiencies in it. There have also been experts who feel that there needs to be more transparency in India's data, especially as far as consumption spending, economic growth is concerned. Do you think that would be an important step going forward?
I think yes. When the going gets tough, yes, consumption pattern takes a beating. I mean, in urban areas, rural areas, both places, there is no doubt about that. And everything needs to be done to stimulate, consumption. Some people are even talking about that perhaps reduction in individual income tax rate, would stimulate that. And also, have more rural-oriented schemes, as a part of the next year's budget or whatever, so that, there is more money available in the rural masses, which stimulates consumption and hence the growth in GDP. I think these things must happen, and a further rationalization. First step of reduction in GST rates have happened, but I think more needs to happen because in automobile and these kind of sectors, situation is not as good. So I think these have to keep happening. I think that's what I said. Today reforms and structural changes should be the order of the day, and they should happen at the speed of thought and big ticket ones. Because early in the cycle of a government, it's always been the case, whether you look at the current government's first term, all the major reforms happen in the first 2 years' time, and then they slow down typically. So I think this is the opportunity. We are done with almost 6 months, and huge set of reforms have to happen. Big ticket reforms have to happen, and all these reforms that I talked about are not just reforms for GDP growth. They will also stimulate the job market, the unemployment situation, which is not very good these days, and India badly needs jobs, not only in terms of new people who are willing to join the labor force, but also a lot of agri sector workers who want to come out of agri, and almost 2 to 3 million, so I think are coming coming out of that every year, agri sector, and they want to have work in the manufacturing or service sector. So I think, these things are very, very important from a GDP growth stimulation point of view, as well as a job creation point of view.
Okay. All right, Mr. Jayant, Krishna, Rajiv, Biswas, thank you very much for joining us on Global Eye and sharing your views on the current GDP numbers and what does the Indian government need to do going ahead. We're taking a short break here on Global Eye, but coming up, visiting Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa hold talks with Prime Minister Modi on strengthening bilateral ties as part for his first official visit. The External Affairs Minister, the NSA, called on the Sri Lankan President Rajapaksa, received a ceremonial welcome at the Rashtrapati Bhavan, held detailed discussions with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The Prime Minister congratulated the President on his decisive election victory and said a stable, secure and prosperous Sri Lanka is important for the whole Indian Ocean. The Prime Minister announced a $400 million line of credit for infrastructure development in Sri Lanka. He also announced a $50 million line of credit for security architecture in Sri Lanka. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, on his part, in a positive gesture, announced the release of all Indian fishermen boats in Sri Lankan custody. To talk about the future of India-Sri Lanka ties, we have Ambassador K.C. Singh with us. Ambassador K.C. Singh, how do you see the optics, the body language of the two leaders?
Well, it's a fresh beginning. As you know, Rajapaksas went out of power in 2015. And there was a feeling amongst them that somehow there was the Indian unseen hand involved in it, because there was a problem. There are two problems that we had with the Rajapaksas. One was, although the civil war ended, LTT was vanquished in 2009, 10 years ago, but the reconciliation and the punishment of people supposedly involved with war crimes, that hadn't occurred. The second thing was their tilt towards China. China came into Hambantota. They were developing that critical port, airport. They came into Colombo. We even saw a submarine surface in Colombo as President Xi was visiting here. So there was this feeling that somehow the coziness that developed with Pakistan and China during the civil war, where India could not give direct military assistance because of the Tamil issue, that then developed into a tilt. Now it is that tilt is two positive signals are that even the Rajapaksa, even Gotabaya, when he's campaigned on the land having been ceded to China because Sri Lanka was not able to repay the debt and the installments. And therefore they said they will work with China to recover that land so that Hambantota port as well as the abutting land next to it is not on a long-term lease, which is a bit like Hong Kong and Macau taken from China. And the second thing is that at the moment, the Tamil question is not an irritant because it's not an issue at the moment in Tamil Nadu, though it can arise in the future. But what is bringing about a convergence, and that is why the security assistance, which you're talking about, is the Easter bombings early this year, where you found for the first time ISIS taking credit for those bombings, which affected the churches, affected some hotels, international community was targeted. On that, there is a convergence between India and Sri Lanka that both see radical Islam as a threat.
Okay. And Ambassador K.C. Singh, he has been written about as someone who is pro-China. Mahinda Rajapaksa was also considered to be pro-China. But can we really make these generalizations, or are we looking at a pragmatic politician who wants the best for his country? Look at the statement he made today alongside the Prime Minister, that when it comes to India, it's a multifaceted relationship, and the relationship we have with other countries is commercial and economic in nature. Do you think here President Rajapaksa only wants more investments, and whoever gives those investments to Sri Lanka will extend that hand of friendship?
No, absolutely correct. And that is why the Indian letters of credit. But I think it's important. The lesson the Rajapaksas may have learnt is that credit doesn't come free. And if the Chinese have come in there, they're not running a charity. And if you can't repay them, and that has been the Indian argument against the Belt and Road Initiative, that this creates a debt trap. These lack transparency. Proper financial calculations are not done, and countries may be incurring or building up a debt which they would not be able to repay, nor probably the facility has been created because Hambantota has not been able to attract too much shipping. You need berthing there. Berthing is a problem. So it's not lived up to its importance, both as a new airport, air terminal, which can be a new fulcrum for air travel, as well as the port itself. And therefore, I think Rajapaksas realize that they may have created that facility, but it's created a debt trap, and actually it's affecting their nationalistic credentials.
And finally, Ambassador Casey Singh, we're running out of time. How would India be best advised to reach out to the new Sri Lankan leadership and keep the ties with Sri Lanka on track in the days to come?
I think we cannot give up the Tamil question. Privately, we don't make it public. Privately we tell them that the war crimes investigations which were going on, apparently the investigator has fled to Geneva. That must go on, because even the Western countries will continue to put the pressure there. But we need not, make it mainstream. Focus more on a direct relationship and rebuilding a new relationship, which I think Gotabaya, President Rajapaksa, is probably seeking.
All right, Ambassador Casey Singh, thank you very much for joining us on Global Eye. Let's move on now. External Affairs Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar and Defence Minister Rajnath Singh are set to meet their Japanese counterparts in Delhi for the inaugural 2+2 dialogue between India and Japan. Increasing maritime security cooperation, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, is expected to be the key issue on their agenda. Therefore, the two sides are expected to discuss maritime domain awareness, military trade and further cooperation between the navies. Indian and Japanese navies have a high level of engagement. Remember, India, Japan and the United States began the Malabar exercise in 2018. Joining us now to talk about this further is Captain D.K. Sharma, former PRO of the Indian Navy. Captain Sharma, thank you very much for joining us on Global Eye. Our first question, what do you think will be the key deliverables out of this inaugural 2+2 meeting between India and Japan?
Well, good evening, everybody. What we can see is that the relationships between Japan and India are on a rise. Our Honorable Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, and Mr. Shinzo Abe have been meeting over the last few years, and it is moving from strength to strength. In fact, during this 2+2, which is the inaugural 2+2, we can expect a lot of talks on maritime security issues, also of maritime domain awareness, sharing of information, having more protocol, how to operate between the navies, and we also expect some movements forward on the equivalent of a LIMOA, that is a Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Understanding. So this is the broad things which might be discussed tomorrow. As such, you have and also you have just informed, we have been doing Malabar since 2015. In fact, this is the first trilateral which India is doing, in which US and Japan are there now, and it is also increasing in complexity and scope every year. Also, we have revived Japan-India maritime bilateral exercise, which was started in 2012. The second edition happened in 2013, and then there was a lull in that, and it was revived in 2018. So, if you see that we are engaging very, very proactively with Japan, and we want to share our best practices and practice in this region, which is becoming a little more sensitive. Yeah.
All right. And very quickly, very briefly, Mr. Sharma, we're running out of time. How important is this relationship for the Indo-Pacific, and how does cooperation with the Japanese Navy fit into India's vision?
You see, now you see the strategic environment in our part of the world, that is the IOR, and you know it that the US has also, retermed it as Indo-Pacific. So now you have the presence of China over here. So all these like-minded nations who believe in freedom of navigation, rule-based order, so they're all coming together. And I must inform you that India and Japan, on this front, we are talking on maritime security initiatives. We are talking on the maritime domain awareness, how it is to be done, logistics exchange agreement, then international cooperation, information security. And these are all expanding words. And as such, I have told you that GMX is there, Malabar is there, and there is no looking back now. As I see, more and more interactions.
Okay.
We are sending our LR MP aircraft, so there's a long-range maritime patrol aircraft. They are coming here. They are doing anti-submarine exercises in our waters. So you know that all this is being done to make sure that should there be a need tomorrow to operate together in this area, it will be done and handled nicely.
All right, Mr. Sharma, thank you very much for speaking to CNBC-TV18. Let's move on now and get you the other big international developments. Iraqi Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi is set to resign after more than 50 people were killed by security forces in one of the bloodiest days of violence since anti-government protests began over a month ago. Hundreds of protesters have been killed and thousands wounded amid a fierce response from Iraqi forces who have used live ammunition, tear gas shells and stun grenades as well. Corruption, mass unemployment and failing public services has led to these protests. China has threatened the United States with repercussions after President Donald Trump signed the Hong Kong Democracy Act, which requires the State Department to annually review whether Hong Kong is sufficiently autonomous to enjoy a special trading status. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has called this bullying behavior and said this act amounts to supporting violent criminals. The Chinese government also summoned the US envoy to lodge a strong protest. The Hong Kong Democracy and Human Rights Act, which received bipartisan support in the United States, has been welcomed by pro-democracy protesters who held a Thanksgiving rally on Thursday. Experts, however, worry about the impact of Trump's seal on this legislation, on this trade tension between US and China. And with that, it's a wrap of this edition of Global Live. But before we leave you with pictures of US President Donald Trump, who paid a surprise visit to the American troops deployed in Afghanistan for this Thanksgiving, making an unannounced trip. Trump reached the Bagram Air Base at 8:30 p.m. and spent more than 2.5 hours on the ground. Thanks for watching.